A single bomb. One precise hit. And a fortress that had stood for decades, with walls meters thick and guns that could shatter armies, was reduced to rubble and silence. Not in weeks of siege. Not under a relentless barrage. But in the span of a heartbeat. In 1914, Fort de Lanson near Liège vanished in a catastrophic explosion when a German 420mm shell pierced its magazine, entombing 350 men inside. The concrete giant, designed to be impregnable, became a mass grave from one shot. But that was just the beginning of a brutal lesson. No matter how deep the concrete, how thick the armor, or how clever the design, a single flaw could turn a stronghold into a death trap. What would you feel if the walls meant to protect you suddenly became your coffin? How could engineers, with all their calculations, miss the one weakness that would undo everything? Today, 10 fortresses that fell to a single bomb, where concrete giants were defeated not by armies, but by one fatal blow. And we start with a fort that should have been invincible, yet crumbled before the enemy even reached its gates. Fort Douaumont. Construction began in 1885 on high ground near the village of Douaumont, and by 1913 it was the largest and highest fort in the ring protecting Verdun. Its concrete roof, 12 meters thick and resting on a sand cushion, was designed to absorb the heaviest artillery impacts. The fort had a surface area of 30,000 square meters, with 2 subterranean levels, retractable 155mm and 75mm gun turrets, and flanking casemates that swept the intervals with 4 more 75mm guns. By the standards of 1914, this was a concrete giant. The problem was not the concrete. The problem was a catastrophic doctrinal error at the highest level of the French General Staff. In August 1914, German 420mm Gamma howitzers had obliterated several Belgian forts in days. Those Belgian forts were built of unreinforced concrete that layered and shattered easily. The French command looked at the Belgian ruins and drew a false conclusion, that no fort, no matter how modern, could survive super-heavy artillery. General Joffre approved the disarming of Douaumont in August 1915. The garrison was reduced to a maintenance crew of 56 middle-aged reservists under a single non-commissioned officer, Chenot. All 4 75mm guns in the Bourges casemates were removed. The only weapons left were the 2 turreted guns too difficult to extract, a 155mm and a 75mm. The moat defenses, the wall casemates with their Hotchkiss anti-personnel cannons, were left unmanned. On February 25, 1916, just 3 days into the Battle of Verdun, a small German raiding party from the 24th Brandenburg Regiment approached the fort in poor visibility. Pioneer Sergeant Kunz climbed into an empty moat casemate, found an unlocked door, and walked inside alone with a rifle. He wandered the empty tunnels, found the artillery team, and locked them up. The entire fort fell without a single shot fired. The only casualty was one man with a scraped knee. The French had abandoned the keystone of their defense because of a theory. The theory was wrong. The fort's 12-meter roof, resting on a sand cushion, could absorb hits that shattered unreinforced Belgian concrete. The Germans proved this by turning Douaumont into an invulnerable shelter, an aid station, and a supply dump just behind their front line. The French would spend 9 months and over 100,000 lives trying to take it back. But the real killer inside the fort was not a German shell. On May 8, 1916, a soldier tried to heat coffee using flamethrower fuel. The fire ignited a stockpile of grenades, which detonated an ammunition cache. A firestorm ripped through the sealed tunnels, killing 679 men instantly. Some survivors, soot-blackened and fleeing, were mistaken for French colonial troops and shot by their own comrades. The Germans sealed the remains in a walled-off casemate that is still an official war grave underground. The greatest French fortress fell to a man with a rifle, and then killed its occupiers with a coffee fire. But further south, another line of concrete giants was about to learn that a single well-placed shell could paralyze an entire underground complex. Maginot Line Auvrecht-Schunenberg. Construction began in June 1931, part of France's eastern wall of concrete designed to bleed any German advance dry. The fort was a subterranean city. 8 combat blocks, over 3,000 meters of tunnels, for Sulzer engines generating power deep underground. It housed 491 men and 17 officers. The combat blocks were clustered, but the entrances for personnel and munitions sat almost a kilometer to the rear, connected by an electrified narrow-gauge railway. The fort's main weapons were retractable turrets, twin 75mm guns, twin 81mm mortars, machine guns, that would rise, fire, and disappear. The concrete was thick, the design meticulous. During the Battle of France in 1940, Schoenenberg became the most shelled position in the entire country. Over 3,000 shells and 160 aerial bombs hammered the position. German 420mm siege mortars cracked walls but failed to penetrate the vital organs. The turrets retracted to absorb the shock, then rose to fire counter-battery salvos. The fort fired over 17,000 shells itself. It did not fall to the bombardment. It surrendered on July 1, 1940, a week after the armistice, undefeated in combat. The real defeat came not from a single lucky bomb, but from strategic irrelevance. The Maginot Line's fatal flaw wasn't a ventilation shaft or a weak casemate, it was the map. The line stopped at the Belgian border. The German army simply drove around it, through the Ardennes, and the immobile concrete giant, still fighting, was left guarding a frontier the war had already bypassed. In 1945, retreating German troops wrecked the entrances and turrets with explosives. The fort was repaired during the Cold War to resist a Soviet advance, then abandoned by the 1970s as nuclear strategy made fixed fortifications obsolete. A titan of defensive engineering, rendered useless not by a shell, but by a change in direction. But the next fortress was defeated by a weapon that didn't need to go around, it simply landed on the roof. Fort Ebony Mail. By May of 1940, this was the largest fortress in the world. Hewn into a plateau bordering the Albert Canal, its irregular shape stretched 750 meters north to south and 600 meters east to west. The garrison numbered around 1,200 men under Major Jotrand. Its concrete and steel bristled with a colossal arsenal, a retractable twin 120mm gun turret with a range of 17.5 kilometers, 2 retractable 75mm turrets, and casemates housing additional 75mm and 60mm anti-tank guns. The designers had learned from the First World War. Ventilation shafts drew fresh air from intake vents on the sheer canal cliff face, and the magazines were buried deep. The fort was considered impregnable. The fatal flaw was a flat, grassy, undefended top surface. The designers assumed an assault across the canal or through the surrounding fields, so the perimeter ditch and machine gun blocks were oriented outward. The roof of the fortress itself was left as a parade ground, with no embedded obstacles, no minefields, and no close-range defensive armament. A scattered group of small observation domes and concrete barracks ventilation covers were the only features protruding from the grass. This turned the fort's greatest strength, its massive, buried scale, into a perfectly prepared landing zone. In the pre-dawn darkness of May 10, 1940, 11 DFS-230 gliders, cast off from Junkers Ju-52 transports, banked over the canal and silently touched down directly on top of the fort. 78 German paratroopers of the 7th Flieger Division poured out. They were not there to fight through the walls. They carried 50-kilogram hollow-charge demolition bombs, a new technology that focused a jet of molten metal through a copper cone, capable of punching through armored steel. The defenders inside the observation domes and turrets were trapped. A single charge placed on the steel dome of an observation cupola instantly turned it into a lance of white-hot metal and pressure that shot into the interior, killing or stunning the crew and filling the confined space with acrid smoke. The 120mm turret, the fort's primary weapon, was wrecked with a charge slipped into its ball race. Within 15 minutes, the Germans had neutralized 7 key embrasures and cupolas. The Belgian gunners, sealed inside their own concrete shell, fired blindly through the smoke, but their weapons could not depress enough to hit the men running across their roof. The underground galleries stretched for over 4 kilometers, connecting the combat blocks to a subterranean world of barracks, a power plant, and ammunition stores. This labyrinth now became a prison. The attackers dropped shaped charges down the stairwells, collapsing passages and sealing the garrison inside. For 24 hours, the 1,200 men were pinned down on their own base, unable to mount a counterattack. Major Jotran surrendered the world's largest fortress the next day. A single weapon, placed on a bare concrete dome, had silenced a concrete giant. But the next fortress wasn't neutralized by a man-portable charge, it took a 6-ton earthquake bomb dropped from the stratosphere. Tirpitz Fortress, HMS Hood's Kill. In November 1944, the German battleship Tirpitz sat in a Norwegian fjord, a 52,600-ton monster that had terrorized Allied shipping lanes for 3 years without ever truly fighting. The Kriegsmarine hit her deep in the narrow waters near Tromsø, surrounded by anti-torpedo nets and a smokescreen system that turned the entire fjord into a grey void. They believed the sandbank they had built up beneath her keel made her unsinkable. She was the last of her kind, the heaviest battleship ever built in Europe, longer than 2 football fields combined and armored with a 320mm thick main belt of Krupp cemented steel. Her 8 38cm guns could throw an 800-kilogram shell over 35 kilometers. Yet this floating fortress had a fatal flaw no amount of armor could fix: she was a ship, and ships roll over when you rip open their hull below the waterline. Her massive size and the narrow fjord meant she could not maneuver, turning her into a stationary target. The British saw this. On November 12, 32 Lancaster heavy bombers carried single 5-ton tallboy bombs designed to burrow into the earth and explode like an earthquake. 2 struck directly. One hit between the aircraft catapult and the funnel, triggering a catastrophic explosion in the ammunition magazine for Caesar turret. The other smashed through amidships, tearing a 14-meter gash that opened the hull to the freezing sea. Tirpitz took on water with a speed no damage control crew could counter. She listed to port at 60 degrees in under 10 minutes. Men inside the armored citadel died trapped by watertight hatches they could not force open. The official death toll settled between 950 and 1,204. The survivors heard the hull scrape the shallow bottom as the ship finished her roll, superstructure digging into the mud. The unsinkable fjord fortress capsized on her side, her keel exposed to the Arctic sky. After the war, a joint Norwegian-German salvage team spent 9 years turning her into scrap metal and razor blades. But 1,200 tons of that armor still sit on a seabed, a monument to the idea that concrete and steel can outthink gravity when a tall boy falls fast enough to crack the earth itself. Fort d'Alençon. Built between 1881 and 1884, it was one of 12 modern forts ringing the Belgian city of Liège, designed by General Henri Brialmont. Its key innovation was also its fatal flaw: unreinforced concrete. This was a new material, and construction stopped every night due to lack of lighting. The daily pours created weak horizontal seams where fresh concrete failed to bond with the previous day's hardened layer. Under heavy shelling, these layers separated. The central massif had a 4-meter-thick concrete cap, but the magazine walls were thinner and placed too close to the surface, never upgraded for modern artillery. On August 12, 1914, German forces brought up a secret weapon, a 42-centimeter Big Bertha howitzer. For 3 days, shells pummeled the fort. The weak concrete cracked and delaminated. Then, on August 15, a single shell pierced the roof and detonated one of the 2 ammunition magazines, containing 12 tons of black powder. The explosion vaporized the fort's core. The concrete massif dislocated, crushing, burning, or asphyxiating 350 of the 550-man garrison. Commander Victor Nessens described it as a titanic volcano. The fort never surrendered, it simply ceased to exist. General Lehman, the sector commander, was pulled unconscious from the ditch and captured. The debris entombed most of the dead, and the site remains a war grave. The destruction exposed a catastrophic design failure, but the very next fortress would prove that even reinforced concrete couldn't save you from a single, well-placed charge. Brest Fortress. By the summer of 1941, this was a sprawling, star-shaped citadel from the 19th century, modernized with thick red brick walls and reinforced concrete casemates. Its central island, the citadel, was a ring of two-story barracks half a mile long, designed to house 12,000 soldiers. The fortress sat on the new border of the Soviet Union, directly in the path of the German invasion. At 4:15 in the morning on June 22, the attack began with a massive artillery barrage. The defenders were caught completely by surprise, unable to form a cohesive defensive line. But the real catastrophe was structural. The fortress had a central ammunition depot packed with stockpiled munitions. German heavy mortars, including the 60-centimeter Thor and Odin, lobbed shells into the compound. One shell penetrated the depot. The resulting detonation was a blast wave that didn't just explode, it physically collapsed entire sections of the thick barracks, burying soldiers and killing the command staff in the first hour. The fortress, built to withstand a siege, had its own heart turned into a bomb. The defense, now leaderless and shattered, fragmented into isolated pockets of resistance that held out for days, and in some cases, weeks. The last pocket, led by Major Pyotr Gavrilov, did not surrender until July 23, after 31 days. The citadel was reduced to a tomb. But where a land fortress could be gutted by a single lucky hit, the next stronghold was a concrete island designed to be unsinkable, and it took a very different kind of single bomb to silence it. Fort Drum, Battleship Island. By the time the Japanese invaded the Philippines in late December 1941, this fortress had already been a monument to concrete for over 2 decades. Construction began in April 1909. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers leveled a rocky islet called El Fraile, then poured a steel-reinforced concrete structure directly on top, shaping it like a battleship. It was 350 feet long, 144 feet wide, and its top deck stood 40 feet above the water. The exterior walls were between 25 and 36 feet thick. The overhead deck was 20 feet of solid concrete. It was, for all practical purposes, unsinkable and impervious to naval gunfire. The problem was not the sea. The problem was the land. Fort Drum was designed to duel warships, not to survive a siege from artillery hauled up to its rear. Its 4 massive 14-inch guns sat in 2 armored turrets, one forward with a 230-degree traverse and one aft with a full 360 degrees. They could hurl a shell 19,200 yards. But that firepower faced the open ocean. The rear approach, the stern of this concrete beast, was a dead zone. The height of the guns above the waterline and a towering 60-foot lattice control mast blocked the rear turret's field of fire entirely. For years, this was a theoretical vulnerability. In 1942, it became a lethal one. Japanese forces on the mainland near Ternate dragged 150mm and 240mm siege howitzers into position and began hammering the fort from the landward side. The concrete chipped away in sizable portions. A 6-inch casemate gun was disabled. The anti-aircraft battery was destroyed. But the main turrets, the thick armor, and the garrison deep inside held. For 5 months, the fort absorbed a concentrated and frequent pounding without a single American fatality inside. The guns kept firing until 5 minutes before the final surrender on May 6. The crew disabled the weapons before capture, and the Japanese simply occupied a hollowed-out concrete shell. The fortress, abandoned but intact, became the last Japanese holdout in Manila Bay in 1945. The Americans returned, bombed it from the air, shelled it from the sea, and then a modified landing ship pulled alongside. Troops scrambled onto the top deck and sealed the Japanese garrison below. The final act was not a battle. Engineers poured a mixture of petroleum and gasoline down a ventilator shaft and ignited it. The resulting conflagration turned the interior into a furnace. The heat was so intense it took 5 days before soldiers could even step inside. The blast found the powder magazine. The pressure blew the concrete roof upward. The permanent out-of-commission status came not from a naval shell penetrating the armor, but from a single fuel bomb poured into a hole designed for air. The concrete giant was defeated by its own ventilation system. But a fortress undone by a stuck machine gun turret and a single lucky shell waits in the next number. Fort Sill, known to the French as Ouvrage de Froideterre. A small but critical link in Verdun's defensive ring, built to plug the gap between the larger forts of Douaumont and Vaux. Its main armament was a single retractable machine gun turret, a model designed to pop up, spray fire, and disappear before enemy artillery could zero in. The problem was brutally simple. The turret's lifting mechanism failed. During an intense bombardment on June 23, 1916, the turret was raised to engage advancing German infantry. A mechanical jam locked it in the exposed position. It could not be lowered. This was a death sentence. A retracted turret presented a low, hardened dome almost flush with the ground, nearly invisible to distant gunners. A stuck turret was a steel billboard screaming for attention. It had a vulnerable collar and exposed moving parts, completely unprotected against direct hits. The German artillery, masters of precision fire, did not miss the invitation. A single heavy shell smashed directly into the jammed mechanism. The impact permanently welded the turret into place, half-raised and utterly useless. The fort was blinded and disarmed in an instant. The garrison, trapped inside a concrete box with no way to fight back, could only huddle in the dark while German stormtroopers swarmed over the superstructure, dropping grenades down the observation slits. The fort held, but only because of desperate counterattacks from the outside. The turret never moved again. A single mechanical flaw turned a fortress into a tomb. But if you think a jammed gear was a catastrophic design failure, the next fortification wasn't even made of concrete. Fort McAllister, earthwork fort. By January of 1863, the Confederacy had a problem. Union ironclad monitors were pushing up the rivers of Georgia, and the port of Savannah needed a shield. Captain John McCready designed that shield on the Ogeechee River. His fort was a massive earthwork, its walls of mud and sand piled over 5 meters thick. General Robert E. Lee inspected it personally and ordered it strengthened. The logic was sound. When a 15-inch shell from a monitor like the USS Montauk slammed into a masonry fort, bricks shattered into lethal shrapnel. But at Fort McAllister, the same shell just buried itself in the dirt. The earth absorbed the impact. The damage was shoveled away and repaired overnight. For 7 naval attacks over 2 years, the fort held. The bomb-proofs, the traverses, the angled walls, it all worked. But this design had a single, fatal flaw. The fort was built to fight ships, not an army. Its walls sloped down into a dry moat, and beyond that, the ground was open. There were no interior redoubts, no keep, no second line of defense. The entire garrison lived inside a single ring of dirt. If an enemy got past the cannons facing the river, there was nowhere to fall back to. On December 13, 1864, General William T. Sherman's army arrived on its march to the sea. General William B. Hazen's infantry division, over 4,000 men, moved on the fort from the landward side. Major George Wayne Anderson had just 230 troops. The fight lasted 15 minutes. Union soldiers swarmed over the walls and into the open interior. The defenders, trapped in their own bomb-proof, had no choice but to surrender. The fort that shrugged off ironclads was overrun by a single brigade. Its strength against the sea was its death trap on land. But a fort's walls are only as good as the powder behind them, and the next disaster proved that the deadliest enemy could be locked inside your own magazine. Fort Sumter. 1865. The war is over, but the fort is a corpse. The Second Battle of Fort Sumter in 1863 had already reduced the five-sided brick giant to a shattered, unrecognizable heap. Union bombardments, lasting for months, pulverized the 50-foot-high walls and collapsed entire tiers of gun emplacements. The fort, designed for 650 men and 135 guns, was now a landscape of craters and broken masonry. The structural integrity of a third-system fortification was gone. But the Confederate garrison didn't surrender because the walls were breached. They surrendered because of a single shell. On September 8, 1863, a Union Parrott rifle fired a solid iron bolt. It struck not the rubble, but the main magazine door. The magazine was a vault deep inside the fort, packed with black powder barrels. A direct hit on that door meant a single spark could trigger a detonation that would vaporize the entire garrison. The physics were simple and absolute. The confined explosion of thousands of pounds of powder would create an instantaneous pressure wave, turning the fort into a massive bomb. The Confederate commander, trapped in a death trap of his own making, immediately lowered the flag. The fear of total annihilation, not the destruction of the concrete, conquered the fort. The garrison surrendered the rubble heap, proving that a fortress's greatest weakness isn't its walls, but the volatile heart it's forced to protect. Concrete and earth could stop armies, but they never stood a chance against a single well-placed detonation. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Drop your idea for the next episode in the comments.